YouTube. So today I want to talk about two positions that have an interesting property in common, and that's trivialism and skepticism. Now, I assume you all know what skepticism is, although I should clarify that in this context, when I talk about skepticism, I mean radical skepticism. So, radical skepticism involves total suspension of judgment. The radical skeptic will be unconvinced that any of our beliefs is justified, and so will refrain from holding any beliefs. At least that seems to be what the radical skeptic is doing, although I'm going to suggest a bit later that things might not be quite so straightforward. But total suspension of judgment. This is a position, like I say, I'm just going to assume that you're familiar with this. I think that really the history of epistemology might be seen as a history of attempts to avoid skepticism. But anyway, trivialism is the other position. Trivialism is a lot less well known. So the trivialist holds that all propositions are true. So it is true that the moon is made of cheese. It is true that I am a scrambled egg. It is true that I do not exist. It is true that there are pink elephants floating around this room right now. And it's true that I have two hands and all of the common sense beliefs are true and so on. Moreover, it is true that trivialism is false. And it's true that trivialism is both true and false. And it's true that trivialism is neither true nor false. And it's true that trivialism is meaningless, etc. Right? So every proposition, everything you can think of, everything you can say, is affirmed by trivialism. Now, this probably sounds like a very strange position if you haven't encountered it before, and I mean it is. Though there are a few people who have defended it quite sincerely, and one of what I think is the most interesting arguments in favour of trivialism is, well, maybe it's not so much an argument in favour of it, but it's just an interesting property, an interesting feature of trivialism. Is if we think about engaging in a debate. I mean, when I express what trivialism is, you're probably going to sort of say, well, that's just crazy. Of course, I don't believe that. But if you think about engaging in an argument with a trivialist, how would you actually go about trying to show that they are mistaken? Well, you immediately run into this problem that the trivialist is going to agree with everything you say. So, like usually when we have arguments, okay, we can specify some proposition upon which we disagree, and then, I offer premises in support of my contention, and you maybe disagree with some of my premises, or you offer different premises of your own, etc. But in the case of trivialism, that's not going to work because every premise that you provide and your conclusion that trivialism is false, the trivialist is going to agree with all of that. The trivialist will agree with all of your premises, and the trivialist will agree with your conclusion that trivialism is false. So, and I mean, that before you even get into any kind of argument with them. You know that the trivialist is going to agree with everything you say. So that might be, that's kind of interesting. It's interestingly unbeatable in that sense. But this also leads to a bit of a problem, because the question then is, well, how exactly do and I take myself to be a non-trivialist, how do I distinguish myself from the trivialist? It looks like trivialism can't be denied, right? Like, I mean, so generally, like, if I'm gonna deny something, right? That looks like I'm gonna have to assert some sort of alternative, but there is no alternative to trivialism because every position is just part of trivialism. Every position is just within it. It's just part of its content. So any proposition that I assert, I'm just asserting part of the content of trivialism. So I mean, it's kind of like this, right? If I say like, for instance, if I was to say grass is green, right? And then somebody was like, no, that's false. Grass is coloured. Like that would be kind of confusing. That would just be a very puzzling exchange because it's like, on the one hand they're claiming to deny my position, but then what they've actually done is just asserted part of the content of it. Because obviously, if I say that grass is green, well, that entails that grass is coloured. So if I say grass is green and you say grass is coloured, you're just agreeing with part of what I'm saying, and you haven't expressed disagreement with anything I'm saying, basically. And with trivialism, the situation is that you can never express any kind of disagreement with it. Everything you say, because the trivialist thinks that everything is true, so everything you say, the trivialist is going to say, "Yep, that's true." Um, so then, how do you distinguish yourself from a trivialist, right? I mean, how do you distinguish me from a trivialist? Uh, for like everything I'm saying is something that a trivialist would agree with. So I mean, it like am I not legitimately interpreted as a trivialist? And the same for the rest of you, right? Whatever you say, it looks like I can just take that as confirming that you are already a trivialist, no matter how fiercely you insist that you are not a trivialist, right? You can bang your fists on the table and say like, I am not a trivialist. Trivialism is false. Trivialism is meaningless. Trivialism is insane. Um, I mean, well, that's what a trivialist would do, right? A trivialist is going to agree with all of that. You're just affirming the content of trivialism. Okay, so with trivialism, it has this interesting property that it's not just like unbeatable in debate. It's that uh, we can't distinguish our own positions from it. Now, in the case of radical skepticism, so total suspension of judgment, it's I think it's similarly kind of obvious that there's some sense in which radical skepticism is also unbeatable. Skepticism is, we might think, unbeatable in a slightly different way, though, because in the case of a radical skeptic, if somebody is suspending judgment about everything, then it looks like there's just going to be no common ground possible. So if I'm talking to someone who's a radical skeptic, I know before I even get into the debate that any sort of premise that I offer in an argument against radical skepticism, they're not going to accept because they suspend judgment on everything. So every proposition I assert, well, they just suspend judgment on it. So in that sense, we might say, like trivialism, it's unbeatable in a similar sense. The trivialist is unmoved because she already agrees with everything we say. The skeptic is unmoved because she suspends judgment about everything we say. But with skepticism, we might at least think, okay, well, I can like distinguish myself from a skeptic. Okay, I can deny skepticism, and I can pretty easily demonstrate that I am not a skeptic to other people. But it's not quite so obvious how to do this when you think about it. So, okay, how could I, like, let's think about this first of all in terms of communicating with other people. What could I do to communicate to you, the viewer, that I am not a radical skeptic? Well, we might think all I have to do is just like assert a belief, okay? So I might say, for instance, I believe that I have hands. Um, but here's the problem. If I am suspending judgment about everything, then I'm going to be suspending judgment about what it is that is communicated by the proposition or by like the sentence, I believe that I have hands. Like for all I know, when I say I believe that I have hands, um, that's communicating suspension of judgment about the claim that I have hands, right? So, like, or if I was to say the proposition, I suspend judgment about everything, right? For all I know, that's communicating that I hold a load of beliefs. Do you see the problem here? Like it's the um, I'm going to have no view about how other people are interpreting my statements. So again, if I'm suspending judgment about everything, then I'm going to be suspending judgment about how other people are interpreting my statements. So I'm going to have no reason to refrain from saying I believe that I have hands, or to say, you know, like, I suspend judgment about whether or not I have hands. So we have like these two sentences. I believe that I have hands. I suspend judgment that I have hands. I'm going to have no view about what's communicated by either of them about how other people are interpreting these. So from my point of view, if I were a skeptic, um, why shouldn't I just say I believe that I have hands? There's going to be sort of I'm not going to have any reason to, you know, prefer that over anything else I might say or do, including nothing. I mean, so like you might think, well, like maybe the skeptic could just refrain from saying anything. You know, like this, the person who suspends judgment at everything, what they would do is they would just sit in silence. Um, but I mean, that doesn't work either, because for all I know, I might be in a society where just sitting in silence is interpreted as communicating loads of beliefs. So, you know, like, we can imagine a society where if you sit in silence, that is assumed to communicate the belief that you have hands. In which case, I'm not gonna, you know, if I'm a skeptic trying to sincerely communicate my suspension of judgment, then you know, I can't sit in silence. Yeah, there's not going to be anything to favour like one thing over another. Um, so okay, that's a problem with communication. You know, you people out there, you have no way of telling whether or not I'm a skeptic, because, you know, I can sit here and, you know, and say, like, I believe that I have hands. I can bash my fists on the table, you know, and be like, I am certain that I have hands. You know, I hold loads of beliefs very, very confidently. But that, if I were a skeptic, because I'm suspending judgment about everything, I'm going to be suspending judgment about what is communicated by the things that I say and do. So I'm going to have, you know, again, like, no reason to favor one type of speech over another type of speech. So yeah, I could, as a skeptic, just sit there and, you know, bash my fist on the table and insist, like, I believe that I have hands. Um, okay, so yeah, that's the problem with communication. Now we might still say, though, well, you know, we can still sort of distinguish the, like, internal mental content, as it were. You know, so what's actually going on in the mind of a skeptic is going to be different from what's going on in my mind, and I can see that for myself. Like, I do hold various beliefs, so I know that I'm not a skeptic, because the skeptic doesn't hold beliefs. But here's the problem. Let's say that you do suspend judgment about everything. Well, now you're going to face the question of, well, what exactly is it to suspend judgment? What does suspension of judgment involve? Perhaps suspension of judgment involves holding loads of beliefs really confidently. I mean, like, why not? You know, so, like, what we want to say is, we want to say, well, if you confidently believe that you have hands, right, or if you are certain that you have hands, then you are not suspending judgment that you have hands. But I mean, like, maybe we as non-skeptics can say that, but the skeptic can't say that, because the skeptic suspends judgment about that. So the skeptic is not going to affirm that. The skeptic is not going to affirm anything about what suspension of judgment actually involves. So, like, once you take that step of suspending judgment about everything, well, now there's going to be no view about what's involved in suspending judgment. So you can just hold a bunch of beliefs, and or at least there's nothing stopping you, right? Um, so I guess that the point is this, right? Our question here is, you know, what exactly is it that the skeptic would, like, say or think? And the point is that there are no constraints, that the skeptic can say and think, and even think anything, right? The skeptic can have the belief that she has hands, and again, like, from the point of view of the skeptic, like, that doesn't sort of like violate skepticism. That doesn't, violate her position, um, by her own lights at least, because she doesn't have any view on what counts as suspension of judgment. So it's in a similar position, I think, to trivialism, right? In both cases, what you have with both trivialism and skepticism is that we're essentially giving up all constraints, giving up all kind of rules of, like rules that might govern beliefs or reasoning or anything like that. There is no particular there is no particular content that is associated with either of them in terms of what people say or think, right? Anything that is said or thought is compatible with both. Um, so yeah, there are no constraints, and I think this fundamentally is why we can't distinguish ourselves from trivialists or skeptics. Like we take ourselves to be non-trivialists or to be non-skeptics. We follow particular inferential rules. There are propositions that we think are true and propositions that we think are false, and so on. And then there are methods of reasoning from true propositions to you know other true propositions. But I think that that maybe the issue here is it's like the classic problem of like, how do we distinguish somebody who is genuinely following a rule from somebody who just happens to act in accordance with the rule? You see, the trivialist and the skeptic can do anything they want, right? So because they can do anything they want, they can like talk and think um, in line with the same sort of rules that the non-skeptics and non-trivialists take themselves to be following. Um, so yeah, I think this is a fairly a somewhat interesting feature of these positions. You sort of want to say that properly understood, trivialism and skepticism sort of make no difference. That, or at least maybe there's no reason why they would make a difference. But then there's every reason why they would make all the difference in the world. So look, I've sometimes kind of played this role, or where whenever I talk to people about trivialism, the majority of people reject it, and they reject it pretty fiercely, right? And so what I have very often done is sort of said, well, like, why should I think that you're not a trivialist? Like, I'm assuming that you are a trivialist, right? So like, I will approach the conversation interpreting them as trivialists, and then I just sort of ask them, okay, so show me that you're not. I'm going to assume that you're already a trivialist, right? Show me that you're not. And of course, there's nothing they can say. There's nothing that can be expressed that would do anything other than just provide further confirmation of my interpretation, right? Like, if you interpret somebody as a trivialist, everything they say is just like, it's just going to confirm that, because everything they say is just going to be what a trivialist could say. And if I'm right about what I've said about skepticism, it would be the same with that. So I found that as a result of engaging in this kind of discussion, I really have come to feel that, like, I really can't distinguish people from trivialists or skeptics, and I really can't distinguish myself from the trivialist and from the skeptic. And yet, it changes nothing, because, like, if I was to convert to trivialism, or if I was to like convert to trivialism, maybe there's no conversion involved, because actually I can just go on holding all of the same beliefs. I can still go ahead. I can go ahead and say, like, I am not a trivialist. That's fine. That's part of the content of trivialism. So like, none of my beliefs need to change. The point is, the trivialist already agrees with everything I say, right? So all of the things I believe, all of the things I disbelieve, that's all just part of trivialism. So if I was to convert to trivialism, nothing changes. And in the same way, I mean, I can't distinguish myself from the skeptic. Like, I might think, okay, if I was to become a skeptic, I would have to give up the belief that I have hands, right? But then, if you think about like what total suspension of judgment would be, well, hang on a minute. Like, why would I have to give up that belief? I don't have what. Why would I have to do that? In fact, right? Why are we assuming that confidently believing that I have hands is different from suspending judgment? I mean, maybe that is what suspension of judgment is. Like, maybe suspension of judgment is holding beliefs really confidently. Um, so you know, converting to skepticism gives me no reason to change anything. And yeah, so it's like the same with with trivialism and skepticism. If I think about what would be involved in converting to those positions, I see that there's no conversion at all. I just end up in the same place I am now. Uh, it's kind of like it's kind of like the Neca cube thing. When you look at a Neca cube, um, there's a shift in your interpretation, and yet you can see that nothing changes, right? Like you perceptually see the same thing, and yet there's a shift, and that's sort of what this feels like. It's an interesting thing to take seriously the idea that, like, okay, maybe I am already a trivialist. Maybe I am already a skeptic. Or to just ask yourself the question of, like, what would be involved in converting to these positions? And then seeing that nothing needs to change. Of course, things could change if you wanted. I mean, if you convert to trivialism, then you can say and do whatever you want. Similarly, if you convert to skepticism, you can say and do whatever you want, which means you can just carry on as before, should you desire to do that. So uh, it's but I mean, not only can you say and do whatever you want. I mean, maybe that's even that is a somewhat misleading way of putting it, because um, it's it's not simply the case that you. It's so like what I say it's misleading because that kind of implies that there are no rules, but actually, if you're a trivialist, there are loads of rules. Um, and similarly for the skeptic, like maybe suspension of judgment involves, conforming really strictly to a whole bunch of epistemic rules. So yeah, like when I, it's very hard to express this. Maybe because this is all just completely meaningless. But if it is meaningless, it's interestingly meaningless. I suppose the obvious question is, why would you sort of take the why would you ever like interpret somebody as a trivialist or a skeptic in the first place? So yeah, maybe nobody can distinguish themselves from the trivialist, nobody can distinguish themselves from the skeptic, but why would you go with that interpretation in the first place? um and I think, well, I mean, part of the answer to that is just because, part of doing philosophy involves, looking at things from different perspectives and seeing what happens. But the other thing is just actually, like, trivialism in particular is just that's a very straightforward, like, face value interpretation of what people are saying. So, uh, again, every proposition that somebody utters is part of the content of trivialism. So if I interpret somebody as a trivialist, I don't have to. I'm not like saying that they're mistaken or that they're lying or that they're engaged in any sort of deception or whatever about what their views are. Um, you know, I'm just taking their statements at face value. You take what they're saying at face value. Everything they're saying is part of the content of trivialism. Um, so yeah, I don't really have much more to say about this, but I think for me, this has been an interesting thing to sort of think through. Um, and you know, I'm in a position now where I can say, like, there's part of me that sort of thinks I but like maybe I am already uh, a trivialist. I'm certainly sure that you are a trivialist and a skeptic, and I challenge you to give me some sort of reason to change that interpretation.